Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our talk with Wesley Lowery from CBS News. I'm Katie Culver. I'm the director of the Center for Journalism Ethics here at UW-Madison and also the James E. Burgess Chair in Journalism Ethics. I'm really excited to be with you today and to have this critically important conversation with Wesley. Before we get going, just a couple of notes of thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank UW-Madison and the Journalist in Residence program that brings Wesley here with us today. This program has been absolutely instrumental in bringing journalists from all over the country and even the world to campus to learn about the tremendous research and teaching that goes on here and to have very important conversations like the one we're going to have today. I'd also like to thank the Center for Journalism Ethics Board. Our board members are wonderfully active and have been terrific in helping us shape virtual programming as we're facing these tremendously uncertain times, and we can't be together in person like we normally would like to be with Wesley as actually in residence instead of virtually in residence. But with the board's help and the help of UW-Madison, we're able to make this session work. This session absolutely would not work without the tremendous help of two people. First of all, Krista Eastman, who helps run the Center for Journalism Ethics. She's just been just a terrific partner in dealing with all of this programming uncertainty. And then also Peter Kleppen from University Communications, who is behind the scenes, pulling all the strings and making this work for us. So thank you very much to them. I'm delighted to introduce you to journalism undergraduate Tamia Folks. She is here with us today. She's a junior in the J School, and she's going to help me interview Wesley. She is a big fan and follower of Wesley's work and has some terrific questions teed up for him. I also should note that Tamia is an advocate for voter registration among her generation. So those of you students who are joining us, head over to Badgers Vote. I know Tamia would really be grateful to you. So let's turn now to our distinguished guest. I am delighted to introduce all of you to Wesley Lowery. Wesley is a correspondent for 60 and 60, which is, I think, as you all know, a 60-minute spinoff over at CBS News. He's also the author of They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore, and a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement. Before we saw him on CBS, you could read Wesley's work at the Washington Post. You also found it in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, Sports Illustrated, GQ. He is quite accomplished. So with great thanks, and we'd love to welcome you to UW-Madison virtually, Wesley. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So we're gonna get going with our questions here. Tamia and I will tee it off, but we'd also like you to know that we're taking audience questions. So at this URL, go.wisc.edu/ask-Wesley. So go.wisc.edu/ask-Wesley. Throw your questions in there, and the wonderful Krista Eastman will be rounding those up, and we'll be, after about 45 minutes of initial questions, we'll turn to audience questions, and she'll be feeding those to me. So at any point, feel free to ask a question, and we'll follow up with it later. So let me start out, Wesley, by saying we are in this cultural moment unlike any other in my entire lifetime, and I'm pretty old. What do you make of where we are right now as a society, particularly when it comes to race and social justice?
I think we're in a really interesting moment. We exist in a moment where so much has changed in the last just handful of decades in the United States of America in terms of how we get our news and information, what voices are involved in these conversations, and the ability of people who otherwise would have had to navigate kind of societal or cultural gatekeepers who now have access to power and to voice. And so what I mean by that is that social media specifically and smartphones have put in the hands of everyday Americans, average Americans, the ability to communicate to mass audiences. You no longer have to own a printing press. You no longer have to convince someone to put you on television or give you a column in the newspaper, but rather every single American now has the power to communicate with every single other American. And so what we see are communities that otherwise had not been fully represented in mainstream media previously or in public conversation previously, now having access to power that is different. And so we see this not just in terms of race, we see this in terms of gender, we see this in terms of sexuality, we see this in terms of immigrant experiences, people who were once minorities and therefore didn't have their concerns often addressed or fully grappled with by society at large, now have the ability to force the conversation themselves, and because they can end around the traditional gatekeepers. And because of that, it allows for a lot of things to be addressed much more quickly. It forces us to be much more responsive to a broader set of people's concerns. And I think that's a lot of what is driving much of what's going on in this moment, again, is the ability for the people themselves to demand what our culture and society are talking about. We live in a much more democratized information environment, which has both good things and bad things about it as well.
So, in terms of those good and bad things, what does this mean for journalism as we've known it? So yes, there's some change in who's setting the agenda, what's driving the questions we're asking, but what are some of the gains and some of the losses, perhaps, from this cultural moment?
Sure. Look, I think one of the gains is that we do see a broader set of things being covered, and we see poor coverage being corrected more quickly. So one thing I always say is that, back in the day, if you had an event, if something happened in your community and the media covered it, you would have to wait till the next day or the evening news to see what that coverage was like. There was no immediacy. And then if there was an error, if there was something that was unfair, that was slanted, that was off, that was missing context, your choice, your only option, your only course of recourse was to write a letter to the reporter or to the editor and hope they got it. And then hope they did something about it days later. We don't live in that environment anymore. That in real time, within minutes of an article being posted, the people involved in the article, as well as the readers, can provide direct feedback to the writers, to the editors, to the publication writ large, and force corrections and altering of information. Currently, if a news organization is not covering a story, is missing something, they can hear about that in real time from the people who want that coverage, as opposed to a previous system in which there was no means of immediately providing that feedback because you didn't know what the news organization was even covering until after the fact. And so I think that in a lot of ways is good. It's smart. A lot of the stories of our moment are stories that, again, kind of began at the bottom up. When you think about a lot of these police shooting stories, when you think about the Me Too stories, when you think about even stories like Flint in Michigan, these were not stories that some reporter cracked open and exposed to us. They were stories that began on social media with people talking about them, and that is what spurred the reporters to investigate.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up such wonderful points about accountability as well, and recognizing the power of social media and doing that. And I noted in your summer article, A Reckoning Over Objectivity, that you noted that deference to precedent is a poor excuse for continuing to make decisions which harm communities or the public that we serve. And so for you, how do you think that we can overcome this status quo and cyclical nature of repeating these injustices and, playing a role as the media in doing so?
It's a really good question, Tamika. I think that one thing I think is really important is, journalism is rightfully and understandably a field and a profession of values and standards. And we learn in journalism school the rules and how they operate. But one thing that we know is that when you learn the rules, when you memorize the rule book, what you learn is all of the ways that the rules are inadequate, the times when you break the rules, the times when the rules are broken or they're outdated, right? And so I think that in journalism, especially given how much our society and our culture has changed, we need to be willing to be introspective as organizations and as an industry, and ask ourselves hard questions to make sure that we are doing the thing we believe we are doing or want to be doing. I think that the vast majority of journalists, the vast majority of news organizations, genuinely, truly want to provide fair coverage. They want to provide pressure to powerful people and organizations. They want to create a fair and objective record of what's happening in our moment so that history has that record. But again, everything about our society and everything about our culture has changed. And so I think it's important for us to make sure that the ways we are operating are serving the purposes that we want. And so there are some examples on this, because sometimes people think that that's like a very radical call and we should change the whole way journalism works. I don't think that's necessary. What I think we need to do, though, is we can't be an autopilot. We can't conduct journalism in 2020 based on a rule book written in 1980. Why? Because the players have changed, the actors have changed, the dynamics have changed. One obvious example of that is that daily newspapers for a long time used to run crime briefs and crime blurbs and mug shots, right? And the idea essentially was, people wanted to know what was going on in their local community if a crime had been committed. But there was no long-term consequence in most cases to being listed in that crime blotter, right? The kid who got a DUI, he's in there and everyone makes fun of him for a little bit, or your neighbor, he breaks into a place and everyone kind of knows he did it, and then the world moves on. The internet changed that completely, right? That the idea of these crime briefs and these crime blurbs were to provide information during the short period of time when it might be relevant, right? Today, if you appear in one of those places, it's going to be the first thing that shows up when someone Googles your name. And so here, something that was about informing a community in a short term actually ends up being something that harms an individual in the long term, right? And so you have a collateral consequence that was unintended because we are following rules that worked at one point that might be different now because of the internet. And so I think that we have to be willing to ask ourselves these questions about each thing that we do in journalism to make sure that it's meeting and matching this moment.
Yeah, and I mean, once again, I think that's such a wonderful point, and it kind of ties to my next question. I think for a lot of young journalists, there's kind of a feeling of being susceptible to only, talking about one story or getting kind of isolated, one-minded, or, being on autopilot and not being able to ask the questions that truly tell the story in a deep way. And have you ever felt that as a journalist, even in your early days of being a journalist, you felt you were losing your sense of self or your capacity to communicate truths when higher-ups were telling you that you weren't being objective per se?
I think in my earlier years, it was less concern about objectivity, but rather a concern about speed, right? And the idea that we produce so much journalism so quickly. Most of the journalism we produce on 1 and 2 day deadlines, right? Where there's only a certain amount of truth that's available to collect. You can't actually reach everyone you need to talk to. You can't actually find all the details and all of the context. That you're doing it as quickly as possible in a lot of ways. And so very often when you try to cover complicated things in a quick fashion, you end up with something that feels lacking or it feels like you're missing something. And so I think that was as much of, for me, the thing I found frustrating was the extent to which I couldn't always guarantee that what I wrote would feel smart to me a week later or 2 weeks later or 3 weeks later. I think that's one of the things that we really have to work on in journalism across the board. Again, understanding that people are consuming our journalism differently on different platforms with different needs, right? That we are no longer the only news source that someone is picking up, that they're no longer starting their day with us the way that generations of people did locally. And that there are other sources of much of the basic information that we used to provide. We are no longer the only place to go to find out if a crime was committed in your neighborhood or if your schools are open today. And that might create a possibility for us to slow down, to take more time, to say we don't need to publish this thing right now, because if a reader desperately needs this piece of information, they have other recourse and other means of finding it. So maybe we take an extra day and find out what actually happened in the shooting, what actually happened in the stabbing. We ask the questions and get more of the answers before we hit publish. I think that our readers want that. I think that one of the things that is really important for us is that we live in a time with so many digital outlets where readers are bombarded with headlines. They're bombarded with media, with journalism. And the vast majority of it is very low quality. It's aggregation, it's a link to a link to a link. It's not, the vast majority of things people are encountering are not New York Times articles or New Yorker articles or 60 Minutes segments, right? And so because of that, I think a lot of folks among our readership, among our viewership, have grown very skeptical. And what they want is to know that when that when they encounter journalism, they encounter news, that it's going to be complete. It's not going to be missing full sides or full angles. It's not going to leave them with an impression that is untrue. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for, again, slowing down, contextualizing, being unafraid to tell our reader what we don't know yet, what questions remain, not talking in a voice of God with certainty when we do not have that certainty. Previously we'd go, well, we can be certain on Monday, and then Tuesday we'll get more information. We'll be certain about that information. And on Wednesday well, it doesn't operate that way. And each time we publish something that leads someone to believe to believe something about a news story that ends up being not a fair or accurate way for them to understand it, it erodes our readers' trust for each time they encounter our work in the future.
Yeah, I think those are all excellent points, and I think I'm a big believer that the average journalist doesn't wake up in the morning and say, "How can I be unethical today?" We have to look at all of the countervailing pressures that cause some problematic decision making, and speed is absolutely one of those. So, Wesley, I don't quite want to leave this topic of objectivity yet, because the piece that Tamia mentioned was just so thought provoking, and I know you did get a lot of blowback from some traditionalists. But I want to dig into just the very concept, the idea of objectivity, and what biases do you see as being built into that concept?
So I think that I think it's impossible to have this conversation without some amount or some level of contextualization. And so I think that very often in these conversations, we forget that for the vast majority of the history of American journalism, we operated with an explicitly partisan press. There was no expectation that the thing you were reading had bent over backwards to be fair, to present all sides. It wouldn't have a point of view. In fact, that's why so many of our places around the country had multiple newspapers. You had a Republican newspaper and a Democrat newspaper. And so around the wars, after the World War periods, American journalism took a shift. Now, we like to tell ourselves in journalism sometimes that this shift was about our high-minded morals. It was a shift that was about making money, that newspapers and the newspaper barons realized that they could sell more advertisers if they could get more subscribers, and they could get more subscribers if they could market not just to the Republicans, but also to the Democrats, and vice versa. And so thus was born the concept of neutrality and objectivity, that you would create a newspaper and a news report that theoretically could service anyone, no matter their biases, no matter their preconceptions. And I think that there was and I think that over time, what we've seen over time is how that has built a new ethic of American journalism, and that ethic has a lot of strengths and also has some weaknesses that have been built into it. Objectivity was intended to refer to the process of journalism, that we would follow a scientific method, that for a given story, no matter who the journalist was, they would call all of the involved people, they would get them to talk on the record for attribution, they would identify them, right? The idea was that for every fact in a story, you were citing your sources, so that theoretically, any reporter could go back and re-report the same story and they would come to the same conclusions. But I guess the first thing I'll say is that I think it's a really important distinction. Like, the system of objectivity was created explicitly because individual journalists cannot be objective, right? That we are all human beings and no human being is objective. My friend, Nicole Hannah-Jones once said that the only thing she's objective about are things she doesn't know anything about yet, right? That as engaged and intelligent people, we do develop preconceptions and opinions about the things that we interact with, right? We see someone walking down the street and we think, oh, that's an attractive person or it's an unattractive person. We look at a meal on the table and we think that looks good or it doesn't, right? Now, can we be swayed from that? Well, yes, we can, right? Our experiences might change how we think of it. But again, to have eyes and ears and a nose is to have preconceptions about the things you encounter in the world. And so again, the system of objectivity was not about creating objective journalists. Rather, it was about creating an objective journalistic process. Although over the course of the objectivity model in American journalism, what we've seen is a shift where that standard is no longer being applied to the model, but rather is being applied to the journalist. And so you have a lot of performative objectivity, journalists who do not vote and declare publicly that they do not vote, as if they can now somehow become objective if they abstain from political engagement. We see very often bad faith actors, or even good faith actors, even people who are genuinely concerned, who are searching for any evidence that a reporter has any political beliefs as a means of discarding and discrediting their journalism, which again presupposes that a reporter would not have any political beliefs. And again, the point here of objectivity is to acknowledge that every reporter does have political beliefs, right? And so we flipped this idea on its head suddenly. And so now any public indication that any journalist has a belief is now a thing that undermines their journalism, whether the journalism is objective or not. Beyond that, though, the objective journalism model works off of what we understand to be news values. And those news values, in and of itself, bias the journalism, right? And what I mean by that, and I'm not saying throw out the news values, but I think we have to be honest about what they do, right? When we think about news value, we think about things like timeliness, unusualness, like impact, right? Like, all of those things bias us towards some stories and some framings of stories and away from other stories, right? Sometimes the most important thing in the country isn't the thing that happened in the last hour. It was the thing that happened yesterday. But when you turn on the news, what will you be watching? The thing that happened in the last hour. Why? Because we have a bias toward timeliness, right? We have a bias towards unusualness. We don't cover any plane that lands, and we cover every plane that crashes. Why? Because it is an outlier. Right? Although, and I'm not suggesting that we should flip that, but I think we have to understand that that is a built-in structural bias. And at times that can come into play. We take things that are unusual, and by repeating them and talking about them all the time, it can make the viewer or the reader believe it's something that happens normally. I grew up in the 90s, which was a time when we all believed that little white girls were being abducted all the time. Why? Because the 2 or 3 times it happened, it was wall-to-wall coverage all day, every day. Right? By focusing on the unusual, we can morph the viewer or the reader's understanding of what is actually happening in the country or in the world. And so I think all of those things are important for us to understand because they are biases in and of themselves, right? They change the way we cover and the way we talk about things. And so, but the other thing I will say is, the word objectivity has also, which really fundamentally means fairness, right? That we're writing things that are objectively true, has suddenly gained all of these additional words that are not really synonyms. So sometimes we talk about objectivity, but we also talk about balance, where balance and objectivity are not the same thing, right? That if you have a true thing, you don't balance it out with just as much of the wrong thing. That doesn't make it objectively true. It makes it false, right? We talk about neutrality. Well, for me, as someone who's spent a lot of time covering violence or murders, if I write a piece about a murder and you walk away from it with neutral feelings about it, with a neutral conclusion about whether or not this murder was good or bad, I would suggest I have failed to impress upon you the objective truth of the thing that I'm writing about, right? So balance, neutrality, those things have nothing to do with objective truth and objective fairness, right? And so I think that, and the way that that manifests very often, especially in our political environment that we live in, one that's been increasingly polarized along partisan ideologies now going back to the 80s and intensifying decade after decade after decade since then, has been that we create a political false balance, right? We know something to be true, but we pull our punch because we don't want the people who are the bad guys to suggest that we're being unfair to them. It is cases where, again, it's a performative objectivity. You're writing a piece about climate change and you go out of your way to find a climate denialist scientist so that no one can argue that you did not have that voice included, even if there's no factual basis to include such a person. We saw this in the early 2000s, a lot of coverage of gay marriage, where we would go out of our way to find the person who wanted to say a mean thing about gay and lesbian people so we could include them in the piece so no one could argue we were biased on this issue. Again, even if the reader or the viewer did not actually benefit from such a conversation, whether that person was actually relevant to the specific story we were telling or not, right? And so I think that is a very, one example I'll give, and again, I think this cuts in every direction, and this is not about one political party or another, although I do think there's some asymmetry in terms of our current political parties. But very recently, the president's former campaign manager was arrested in Florida following what appeared to be a drunken domestic violence incident. He had some guns. He was in the midst of a mental health crisis. And after he was arrested, the president's campaign put out a statement. And the first part of the statement was, Brad Pascal is a member of our family. We're praying for him. We hope he gets well. The second sentence of the statement was a hysterical attack on the media, right? And this is why the mainstream media is so terrible, attacking him all the time, and X, Y, and Z. Added no substantive value, was clearly based in nonsense. He hadn't even been in the media recently, right? And some news organizations ran that statement in its entirety. They provided information that was objectively false, objectively irrelevant, so that no one could accuse them of not quoting the full statement in full. What I would ask is that a service to our readers? Does that serve our readers? Or does it obfuscate the truth? That we should not provide our platform to people who are saying things we know to not be true, no matter what the potential political ramifications of that are.
I think that's, again, a fascinating set of questions. And that last one, I think, ties back to your earlier point about what we consider to be news values. And one that's been traditionally, adhered to is the idea of conflict, that people will do things that feature conflict more than those that don't. And so, a press release that kind of, starts pulling out the news media as a punching bag is an example of conflict and would be seen as a better story. So those are just absolutely fantastic insights there. I'd like to turn to what it's like right now for journalists of color. So we've seen an outpouring of stories about experiences within newsrooms. Tell us what you think journalists of color are seeing and hearing and feeling in newsrooms today.
I think one of the things we have to remember is that mainstream media news organizations have only been integrated for a handful of decades, that it wasn't until the 70s that there were any efforts in earnest to have Black reporters, much less brown reporters, in American newsrooms, and that even through the 90s, there was a lot of gnashing of teeth around the idea that you would bring in reporters of color, that much of the media disputed the idea that diversity of staffing was some type of journalistic imperative. Now, I believe that is a journalistic imperative. We cover a complex, complicated, diverse world, and we cover it by access to information, right? We traffic in information. And so a newsroom that's attempting to tell the most accurate, broadest, most insightful stories and provide the most insightful coverage of this massive, complex, diverse world needs to have people inside its newsroom with access to all this information, to various communities, to understand how different people are perceiving what's going on, to hear about other stories. Look, I get story tips from my Facebook feed. Well, who's in my Facebook feed? The people who I grew up with and went to church with and went to college with, and who I was friends with in the cities I lived in. A set of different journalists each journalist is gonna have a different community that way. And what we know in a country that is still largely racially segregated, and where experiences are very often racialized, right? We know that if you don't have different types of people in your room, you are going to miss out on all types of stories, all types of angles. And you are going to start to have the bias of the few be framing coverage of all of these issues, right? How might political coverage look differently? Political coverage of immigration look differently if there were more immigrants who were involved in that coverage? I'd suggest it would probably look pretty different. And so I think that is really, really, really important to remember, right? One, that I do think that we need to have newsrooms that reflect the countries that we live in every way, and when we do not currently, nor have we ever. But secondarily, I think that we have to understand where journalists of color in these newsrooms are coming from now, because they are very often the only ones, because they are very often tokenized, because they're very often asked to stand in for large representative groups of people. George Floyd happens, Breonna Taylor happens, and a whole room of white journalists turns to the one Black woman at the end of the table and says, well, what are people saying about this? What should we do about this, right? That it's a fundamentally impossible position to be in. And what is also true is that because of the subjective nature of the work we do in the first place, deciding what stories matter, deciding what sources to trust versus which ones not to trust, right? If you have editors and newsroom leaders who are a monochromatic group, who all represent a specific set of interests, have specific sets of backgrounds, their inclinations are very likely to be similar and to not align with that of the handful of journalists of color in their newsrooms, right? And so what we see is crackdowns on journalists of color. in ways that we might not see otherwise. A reporter in Pittsburgh who was run out of her job for tweeting a joke about the violence in the streets, while you might have a white political reporter who's best friends with the people he covers. And that's not seen as an undue bias, but rather being too close or too black to the Black community, that is. Right? We start to see the sliding scale, the subjective sliding scale of objectivity and how that plays out. And so we might see this in the way that stories are covered, right? Because even once you decide to cover a story, there's a huge difference between how you frame it, what you lead with, what sources you value, what skepticism you express. And so again, I think very often journalists of color talk about the difficulty of being one of the only one like them in these rooms and how frustrating and crazy making of a process that can be.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, what advice would you give to young journalists, especially young journalists of color, as they enter this field? And kind of also, what does safety and like existing within this space look like for people, since you're going to all of these events and these situations where it might, not feel safe all the time, or you might be the only person that looks like you? And how do you deal with that?
I think a big part of it is finding community. I think it's why a lot of journalists of color get involved in organizations like the National Association of Black Journalists or Hispanic Journalists or Asian American Journalists Association, the IWL Society, because there are other journalists of color out there who are going through very similar experiences. And so there's a reason that those groups tend to be so tight-knit, is because there's a shared experience there. And so I think that's very important. I think a big part of it also is kind of this understanding that you follow the rules so that eventually you can break them, right? That you do the work that you can to gain a cachet in the room in which you work, to gain a credibility in the place in which you work, so that hopefully the system in which you work will start listening to you, that your voice will have additional power. Now, that can be really difficult. It can be really frustrating to not necessarily trust all of your colleagues on these issues. But it's something that I think a lot of journalists work through. But beyond that, I remember my high school journalism teacher telling me this once, but the reality also is, journalism is a field, it is a profession in which you have to operate on your own ethical compass. And so which means you have to be willing to stand up to your bosses when they want you to do things you should not do or you do not believe you should do. You have to be willing to say no, and you have to be willing to walk away if you're asked to do something that you yourself cannot abide, because you are the only person who's protecting your byline, your name, and your reputation.
So we've seen you, Wesley, in Kenosha, in Minneapolis, and some, as Timea was noting, some places where safety is a concern. But what about the sort of spiritual and emotional toll of the work that you do? How do you deal with that when you're dealing with these life and death issues?
I think a lot of it is that this type of journalism is important. And I think that, I think unfortunately in journalism, and I don't think this is unlike a lot of other professions, but unfortunately in journalism, we can be a little bit self-obsessed. That in most of these cases, I'm not even close to the most traumatized person in the story. All the people I'm talking to are far more traumatized than I am. That's not to say this isn't difficult. It's not hard to grapple with this. And I think there are ways to mitigate that and deal with that. And also, I think it's important to remember that, there is something about us not being the story. And I think that's important. What I will say is, for me, someone who's been on a beat that has a lot of trauma involved, that is very politically charged very often, among the things that I think about is making sure that I'm taking the time I need, the space I need. We do our best writing when we're well-fed and well-rested. Then we have a clarity of mind. We do our best thinking, and therefore we do our best writing. I'm trying to make sure that I'm disconnecting when needed from the online chatter, right? We live in a time where things move so quickly. And again, very little of our best thinking and writing happens in moments where we have all these different inputs happening. I also try to be judicious about how often I'm jumping into these stories. that I don't have to write about every police shooting. I don't have to write about every school closing. I don't have to write about every single iteration, but rather I'm trying to choose the times when I expose myself to trauma and traumatized people, to the moments and the spaces where I'm going to be able to tell a story that feels unique, that's going to cut through the noise and is actually hopefully going to move the conversation forward, right? That the goal is not to write as many pieces as possible. The goal is not to, now to be clear, you do have to do repetition to gain a level of expertise, to understand what the smartest story is. By the fifth time you've covered something, you know it a lot better than the first time. But again, you hit a point where you start to think about, all right, what's the smartest way to do this work? And that means choosing the right targets, framing the pieces the right way, and not bogging yourself down with a lot of extraneous coverage that actually just distracts you and wears you out.
Let me turn to journalism education and our responsibilities within within my business, not just your business. How should we be talking about race? How should we be talking about objectivity? How should we be talking about this social moment?
I think we should be talking about it. I think we should be asking ourselves hard questions. I think that, again, in addition to being a little self-obsessed, I think journalists often are pretty poor at being introspective in thoughtful ways. I think it can become very defensive. I understand that. We were talking about a time where journalism is under attack, and anyone working today has worked in a period like that. Again, it's been pretty consistent going back to the Nixon administration. And so you understand why there is a defensiveness of the field, of our values. That attack is not only coming from the outside, it comes from the inside, people who are masquerading as journalists, as reporters, as news organizations who are not. And so I think that's extremely important as well to note. But I think we do have to ask ourselves really hard questions as an industry, as a field. I think we have to ask ourselves questions about everything. Why do we do things the way we do them? I remember when I started at my college newspaper, the desks were all set up in a weird way because there used to be a computer here and there used to be a printer here, but then it died. And so no one ever moved the desk. And I remember the first thing I did when I became the editor of the college paper was I moved all the desks around so they actually made sense based on the equipment we still had. And so I said, well, why did you move the desk? And I said, because they didn't make any sense where they were. They were just remnants of a world that didn't exist anymore. And so I think we have to ask ourselves these questions, not just in newsrooms. I think we have to ask ourselves this in journalism education as well. What are we teaching and why are we teaching it? What are the skills that our students need as they enter this world today? And how do we make sure we're doing and embracing that? How do we update our curriculums in those conversations to address the moment we are living in currently? And that, again, is not static. It's ever changing. The answer to that question today is different than it was a year ago. And whatever I said today will be outdated by a year from now, right? That we live in a world, that journalism lives in the news world. And the news changes every hour of every day.
I am totally stealing that desk story. I'm going to be telling that all the time. That's an absolutely fantastic, fantastic story. What a metaphor for where we are right now in journalism. So one of the places we are right now is in the midst of the 2020 election. So let's take a little turn there. What role do you see race playing in this election? And how does that challenge journalism?
It challenges journalism a lot. And I think any time we have a massive societal and structural construct where the vast majority of people producing the information come from one understanding of it, we end up losing and missing a ton of the rest of it. And so here's what I'll say. I think an example of that is if you look at the Democratic primary, there was a lot of internet conversation about Joe Biden, would he lose black voters, to what extent would his history on things like the crime bill and being friends with segregationists in Congress, how would that harm him with black voters? And to be clear, especially among younger black voters, those are major, major issues because those voters tend to be much more liberal and much more progressive. But to understand black voters as an entirety and to understand the Democratic Party coalition is to understand older black voters and Southern older black voters, most of whom were extremely loyal to Joe Biden, always were going to be loyal to Joe Biden, and are much less progressive than their grandchildren and their children. And so because of that, you can have media coverage that is constantly tripping over itself, worried about Joe Biden losing the black vote, even though Joe Biden was never going to lose the black vote. And that, again, comes from not understanding and not knowing voters. What we're seeing now, I think one of the most undercovered stories of this election, of this race, is Trump making inroads with Latinos and making inroads with Black men. And that's not to say there's been no coverage. The Washington Post magazine just did a smart piece on this, and there have been a few others. But I do think that we haven't seen that type of coverage permeating, those questions permeating, because in order to understand that those dynamics at play, you have to be talking to Latinos and Black people. And unfortunately, that's not something that a lot of our political press corps is regularly doing. And so I think that when you look at issues of race, you always have to understand who it is you're not talking to and how they might be influencing this. And also the potential for backlash, right? And so I think when we look back at 2016, there was a massive understatement of the backlash to Black Lives Matter, the backlash to the immigration policy of the Obama years, which, by the way, wasn't even frankly that liberal, but there had been a lot of demagoguery around those issues in conservative spaces, and there was a lot of concern about immigration in the country at the time. And so, again, all of those issues are spaces where race factors in, that race is a major part of our current kind of cultural wars. And so we have to understand both how people of different races operate, and also then what the potential backlash from a white majority that is quickly becoming a minority is also operating. And so, again, race permeates every issue in our society, every issue in our culture. And unfortunately, not enough reporters understand that, and not enough reporters cover the thing that they cover through that prism.
Yeah, those 2 points, not being proximate to people who can tell you what the story actually is. So losing Latino voters from one coalition to another. If you're not proximate, you're going to miss that story. And then the backlash story, I think, also was so undercovered. Let me just ask you, what do you make of the president's failure to denounce white supremacy in the first debate?
I actually think it's a very interesting. So I think there are a few things, right? First and foremost, I think that's a very easy. Objectively, I think that's a pretty easy question with a pretty obvious answer, and I think that strategically, or just as like moral and ethical humans, there's not much excuse to stumble over that answer. Secondarily, I also think that this is an excellent ink blot test for the polarization of our readership and our viewership. That this is one of those, when you look at the transcript of what was said and what wasn't said, there are enough kernels in it for people with diametrically opposed views to latch onto the narratives that they prefer, right? And so what you see here is the President of the United States is asked to will you denounce white supremacy? Which, by the way, terribly phrased question, right? You don't ask someone if they are willing to do a thing. You've created a yes/no question when you're asking them to affirmatively do the thing. So he says, sure. Well, to a lot of people, he just said he will denounce white supremacy, right? Shouldn't have been phrased that way in the first place. As there's all this crosstalk of this muddied and muddled debate, the president then trips over his words seemingly, and says, it says that the Proud Boys, a group that he had gotten that name from Joe Biden was shouting out Proud Boys, denounce the Proud Boys, that Trump says Proud Boys, stand back and stand down, or whatever he says, which again, you look at the literal words and it sounds almost like a call to arms, right? And so so people who are inclined to see the president as winking and nodding at white supremacist groups say this is clear and obvious evidence of that. Folks who are inclined to see the president as someone who doesn't speak in complete sentences and often mumbles and says things that don't make sense are inclined to see this as the president doing what he always does, which is not really making much sense. But a moment ago, he said he was willing to denounce them. So what are you guys talking about? It's another one of these areas where so often our readers and our viewers are living in opposite worlds. They're consuming opposite media. They have bought into opposite narratives. And so both sets of people see something that they see as remarkably clear. And the other set sees the exact opposite of it. And I think that that's something that's really difficult for us to navigate collectively. I think it's something that's driven by our political parties, particularly the Republican Party, but both of our political parties, and certainly driven by conservative media, Fox News and others. And so again, we very often live in completely separate worlds. And so we're analyzing the same objective facts through drastically different lenses.
Absolutely. And considering the overwhelming nature of the 2020 news cycle and kind of just the fast-paced nature of it as well, how do you go about your journalistic process and finding the stories that really are important and worthwhile?
Sure. I mean, much of my journalistic process involves ignoring all of the news cycle completely. Focusing on something I care about, that I want, that I know is important, a story I want to tell, a person I want to profile, a place I want to go, and really drilling into that and trying to close my ears to all the noise of what's happening in the meantime. And so I think that's a really big part of it, right? That so often we can be distracted by the million different headlines and things going on that it prevents us from focusing and having the concentration we need to really tell a story the way we want to tell it. And so I think it's really important as journalists we have to cover the news as it happens, but when you have the opportunity to break away on a story, to try not to be distracted by the shiny object, but rather to stay focused on the thing that you know you're trying to do.
For sure. And I mean, you bring up so many good points. I'm just wondering, what do you think the journalist needs to do better now? And also, I'm curious, what can consumers of news do better to really take in these stories and try to be, as clear-minded as they can be when reading them?
So as journalists, like I said, I think we still need to break our reliance on speed. I think we need to recommit to follow-up reporting. Very often people focus on being the first to have a story, but I actually very often in my work try to be the last person to write about something. Because when you are the last person to write about something, you often write the definitive piece. You can talk to everyone. The people who didn't return the calls on the first day might return them on the 60th day. The documents that were unavailable now might be. The investigation might be over. I think we need to do much more coverage at the end of stories when we actually know what's happening, where we can create a definitive record, as opposed to at the beginning of stories when everything remains gray. Again, I think more people need to encounter our journalism and see work that is fully considered, fully thought out, and fully developed. That I think we really get penalized by our desire constantly to lean into speed. I think that news consumers need to pay for their news. We've lived in a world where the news was largely free on the internet, which was totally different than the newspaper world, where you always paid for news. And so I think that that's important. I think that we need to support our local journalism as much as anything else, and in our nonprofit journalism, because I think that, again, if we believe that journalism is necessary for democracy, it's important that we live those values with our pocketbooks as well.
All right, I'm going to turn now to some audience questions. Krista is feeding them in to me, but please feel free to continue asking them at the link. We'll get through as many as we can. So from Natalie Yar, who used to be a student fellow in the Center for Journalism Ethics, just have to give her a little shout out. In your op-ed on objectivity, you said journalists should strive for, quote, moral clarity. What would coverage of police violence look like if journalists were practicing that moral clarity? Is our current approach encouraging our audience to feel ambivalent?
I do think I do think our current approach can lead our audiences to feel ambivalent. I think that, I think when we talk about moral clarity, we're talking about moral clarity of journalistic process, right? And so again, moral clarity sits opposite or sits opposed to the way we've always done it in journalism, right? That what we're asking ourselves is are we advancing the truth by quoting this person, by framing this way? Are we appropriately skeptical of powerful people? Are we creating a false balance in a place where it doesn't exist, right? Moral clarity doesn't sit opposite of objectivity. It's a thing that informs the way we try to create fair and objective journalism. And so what I think we do in that space around policing, first and foremost, is that, again, our job is to hold accountable the most powerful people in the stories we cover. The police are among the most powerful government agencies and systems in our country. A police officer is the most powerful person most Americans will ever encounter in their life. Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, they can't pull out a gun and shoot you in the chest. Every single sworn police officer in the country can do that. That's an extreme amount of power, and that power requires skepticism and it requires accountability. And the press is supposed to play that role. And so those things are as simple and easy as, when the police are the only source in a story, not framing the story as if we actually know what happened. How many headlines do we see where it's knife-wielding man shot during bank robbery, comma, police say? Well, any reasonable journalist walks away from that believing, or any reasonable reader walks away from that believing there's no dispute that this is what happened. Have we interviewed that man, his attorney, his family? No. Typically, we've gotten a press release from the police and we've thrown it on the front page of the newspaper, right? The way we adopt police jargon. Officer-involved shooting, a term that was literally invented by the PR department of the LAPD. In the line of duty, a piece that is valorizing what the police are doing as a norm, right? That is not neutral. That is not dispassionate. It is a thing that is valorizing a public servant, right? And we can both praise and be thankful for people who go into public service without building into the way we cover them the assumption that what they are doing must be good. We don't refer to city council members that way. We don't refer to the garbage men that way. I have no idea how many garbage men have been killed in the line of duty, because it would never be written that way. And so I think that we have to be, again, we have to understand that so much of what the media does is frame. It tells and signals to people how they should perceive the news they are reading. And very often, that framing is not neutral. It suggests narrative in one direction or the other. We see this in the obsession with armed and unarmed in shootings, because unarmed is meant as a framing word. This might be bad. This person didn't deserve to get shot. Unlike the armed people who you can skip to the next story. This person probably had it coming, right? It's a signal that has nothing to do with the actual details of what may or may not have happened. We live in a country where it is legal to be armed. The presence of a firearm does not mean that you have committed any crime. And so again, I think that very often we have to, we so often in these stories, in the way we headline them, in the way we lead them, are attempting to signal to the reader how they should interpret the news, as opposed to just telling them what the news is.
That's absolutely thought-provoking. You managed to answer two questions in one. Ruth Gilmore had a question about how we should reconsider our relationship with police, especially given that we depend on them so deeply in our profession. So particularly in breaking news, where do you go if you don't go to the police? So I think those are the normalization and valorization are two critical points, I think. Next up, I'm going to go to a question from Jay Golk. So mainstream media outlets now seem to be more willing to call a lie a lie. That said, coverage of those who abuse power for their own benefit is often still too credulous. Future public officials, corporations, foreign actors will get more and more skilled at media manipulation. As individuals in America, what can we do to keep the media going in the right direction? What can we do to help journalists?
Sure. I think the conversation around this in the last few years has really advanced. Journalists have a real hang up around anything that could be perceived as them anything that could be perceived as them projecting that they know someone's true motivation, right? And so in a lot of newsrooms, the concept of a lie requires a deliberateness, right? That you know the thing that is true and you know what you are saying is untrue and you are saying it anyway. A lie as opposed to misspeaking, a lie as opposed to just being wrong and earnestly being wrong. And I think that is the reflection of, I think that is the source of a lot of hesitancy to call lies lies. However, and look, and I'm someone who is sympathetic to that position, but I also think even without calling something a lie, we could be very clear about its inaccuracy, right? We can say that the president today baselessly claimed that X, Y, and Z is true without having to litigate whether we think he knew it was untrue when he said it or not, right? There's a universe in which the president might believe some of these things he says, even though they are not true. And again, I think there was a hesitance and a pearl clutching around even using language like that, right? We're clearly stating that this thing is not true. And I think that that is extremely important. I think that too often we are unwilling to do that, and we allow people to hijack our communication methods and the platforms we give them. When we say the president says he's going to shut down the New York, Trump, I'm going to shut down the New York Times in a headline, he can't do that. So that's the equivalent of allowing the homeless man on the street who says, I'm going to be president tomorrow, and putting that in the headline. Right? Like, we have to be engaged enough and honest enough brokers that we don't allow a casual reader to believe something to be true that is not true. I think that's really important. I think that the biggest thing, though, that normal readers can do is they can be engaged readers. They can email the writers of the pieces that they're reading. They can interact on social media. They can reach out with critiques, but also with praise, with criticism, but also with suggestions, with story ideas, right? That most journalists want to get things right, and most journalists, when they encounter thoughtful readers, are willing to talk to them and willing to listen to them. And I think that that pressure from the public very often can start to bend things. I think it's what started bending things under this current administration in terms of the way some of these things were handled.
You raised some really good points, but I'm going to tie back to your rearranging of the desks and say that color me a little bit skeptical. I think some of our traditional practices aren't necessarily serving readers. So things like the president said without evidence is very different than saying something was a baseless claim or something is untrue. And so some of those linguistic practices definitely need some reflection and examination.
Mm-hmm.
A related question to the last one from Jennifer Heckman: what can the general public do to make sure that journalists are protected? Not just that they're headed in the right direction, but that they are protected.
I think being engaged on press freedom issues, I think, is extremely important. We have journalists across the country who face criminal charges for arrest to protest. We have journalists across the country who are facing additional barriers to access to information. We obviously have a president and a political party that villainizes the media, uses the media as its whipping boy, and that has can have real ramifications in a country where we have mental health crisis across the country, as well as access to firearms. That is a scary environment. Anyone who is villainized, is not unreasonable to have actual literal fear for their safety in this nation. And so I think that being engaged on all these issues, being supportive of some of the groups that work on them, being engaged and responsive readers, I think, is really important. And also being engaged and responsible citizens on this. I think that, again, we live in a world where we have a lot of elected officials who choose to use the media as their scapegoat. And I think that those elected officials probably need to hear more often from the people who represent them, not just about everything else, but specifically about how the danger of the way the media is being trotted out this way. And I think that if more citizens were leveling those complaints, perhaps it might move some of these political parties to operate differently.
Yeah, and not just citizens, but some power brokers as well. So, corporate leaders and other people who have influence. So next up is a question from Morgan. Can you speak a little bit more about what some people call movement journalism? And then secondly, could you define the difference between advocacy and solutions-based journalism in prestige institutions like CBS News?
Well,
looks like Wesley may have frozen there. Might have a tiny technical glitch. Oh, Tamia, maybe you'd like to take the question about movement journalism. I'm just kidding. I think it is a really interesting question. Oh, welcome back, Wesley.
Am I back? Can you hear me?
You are back. You are fully back.
Sorry
the
about
question was about, I don't know if you heard the whole thing, but about movement journalism. And then a second question about what's the difference between advocacy and solutions-based journalism at a place like CBS News?
Sure. And so I can't speak for CBS News, but I can attempt to answer that question. I always want a disclaimer before I get hauled in. But I'd say a few things. The terminologies are always shifting and changing. They're defined a little differently by different people. Movement journalism is a term that I understand to be relatively new and contemporary. And as someone who's been in these journalistic spaces for a while, I've always been really interested in exactly how that manifests and what that looks like. I've never quite known if I would consider myself a movement journalist or not. My understanding of movement journalism comes from my understanding that journalism is a tool. It's a means, right? It's a specific thing. And so all types of people do journalism. People with explicit biases and who are fighting for specific outcomes do journalism and use journalism as a means to get to those outcomes. People who are whose goal is to document what is going on in real time use journalism to do that, right? And they might do that under a more objective model. And so I think that there's a balance between those two things. My understanding of movement journalism is journalism that is, from its inception, working to advance the goals and the means of a given movement, be it the movement for Black liberation and equity and equality, be it the movement for women or for gay and lesbians or whomever, right? And so I think my understanding of that is I think that there's a room and a role for that. I believe in a mosaic theory of journalism. And what I mean by that is that there's not one way to do journalism. And in fact, that we live in the most healthy environment when there's many different types of journalism happening at the same time, because we all push and pull on each other in different directions. I think that when I think about advocacy versus solutions journalism versus activism, again, I think you get 10 journalists here and we would all define those words differently. I think two different things are true. I actually think that journalism, in many of its forms, including many of its quote unquote objective forms, is a form of activism, right? When I demand the public's right to know and demand public records, that's an act of activism. There are people who would suggest that no, the public does not have a right to know this. I'm taking a stand on behalf of a thing. Right? When the Boston Globe writes about the Catholic Church and the priest scandal, they are doing that because they believe the children deserve justice and some type of recourse, right? They're not just doing it to document and so very often among the best journalism we are doing is explicitly about influencing some change or righting some wrong, a form of activism. The difference, I think, and that activism is rooted in a set of values that we have as journalists. Theoretically, we believe in justice. We believe in equality. In the states, very often we believe in democracy and representation of some sort, right? These are subjective values. Other places might not believe in those things, right? And again, I think we pretend as if those are not subjective decisions. They are, right? And so very often we do journalism that is tethered to those values, and that journalism is in and of itself activism in the direction of those values. The advocacy, I think, is different. Advocacy, I think, is, I think every journalist might define these things differently. I think of advocacy as the promotion of a specific solution to a set of problems. So the example I will give is I live in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., I have no voting representatives in Congress. That I, in our democracy, am less represented than anyone watching in Wisconsin. I have no senators, which means I have no say in the Supreme Court. It means I have no say in voting rights. It means that I'm legitimately less democratically represented than most Americans. The vast majority of Americans. I think that a objective journalist can say that if our value is democracy, is that within this system we think everyone should have a relatively equal voice, I think we can write that clearly. I think we can state clearly that it's obvious that the people of Washington, D.C. are disenfranchised and are not being granted the full citizenship rights that everyone else is. These are objective facts. And by repeating those facts, one might argue that that's a form of activism towards the correction of that, right? Advocacy would be saying, and so the solution is statehood. There are other possible ways that might enfranchise the people of DC. You could fold DC into Maryland, for example, and so suddenly I would be represented by the senators of Maryland. I would have a chance to vote for that. You could come up with some other, compromise or some other thing, right? So there's a difference between being an activist around a specific inequality and advocating a specific solution to that inequality. Solutions journalism is a world in which we understand that a lot of journalism is about documenting problems. And solutions journalism looks at exploring and raising the questions of possible solutions. That grows in part out of, I think, a reluctance from a lot of journalism to explore solutions because they don't want to be seen as endorsing them. Right. And so if we do a profile on this organization that's trying to fix this thing, are we saying that this is the right way to do it? Again, it speaks to our biases built into our news value, where we have no issue covering the problem. We'll cover the problem for a million years. But wait, write about someone who's trying to fix it? Oh, I don't know. Might that come across as? And so I think solutions journalism is extremely important as well. We need to be providing smart exploration of the potential solutions to problems.
There's research to back it up that people who consume solutions journalism versus journalism that just illustrates social problems feel more political efficacy. They feel that they have a stronger voice. They have more hopefulness about progress. So there's real importance in that movement. Samia, let me turn it to you for our next
Absolutely.
question.
And I think for sure today, a through line of our conversation has been giving voice to communities that might not usually have access. And so one of the questions we had from an audience member was, why do legacy media tend to not look at ethnic media for ideas, sources, and leads? And why is there no collaboration usually between these groups?
Oh, well, look, you can't look at something that you don't know it exists. And so I think that, so ethnic media is targeted at and serves ethnic communities, is distributed in those spaces, and very often by our non-ethnic colleagues is not seen as a legitimate source of news if they're even aware of it. I grew up in a house, I grew up in Cleveland. We got the Cleveland Plain Dealer every day, which was the mainstream media. We watched the local news every day. And also once a week, my dad went and picked up the Cleveland Post, which was the black newspaper. So I might look there for story ideas because I had access to it. I knew it existed. I think that very often when we're not a member of a community, we're not looking for it. We're not checking for it. And I think that too often doesn't happen. Look, I think the ethnic media is extremely, extremely important in the mosaic of journalism. That we need community-specific and organizations, specific news and coverage, right? We need news coverage that covers the labor movement specifically. We need news coverage that covers ethnic communities specifically, or women specifically, or scientists, because we need that expertise, right? But again, I think it's our job as journalists in the mainstream to be paying attention to those spaces and to those sources, and making sure that what's being reflected in those spaces make it into our coverage as well and into our conversations as well.
Absolutely. And before I lead into the next question, I'm just curious, you brought up that notion of legitimacy. Why do you think it is that, usually journalists who work for ethnic media outlets or publications, why do they usually not get that same respect?
Well, look, I think that in our industry, respect is very often correlated to prominence. To how many readers you have, how many subscriptions you've sold, how big your cable network is, right? In part because there's often the perception of a correlation between that prominence and the impact of your work. If people know 1 million people are going to read this tomorrow, they're a little more scared of it than if they think only 10 people might see it, right? And so I do think that there is some complication there. But what's also true is the role the ethnic media often plays is they are willing to ask questions and get things on the record and follow issues at a level of minutia that matters to their communities in a way that the mainstream is never going to serve, right? When you're trying to do everything, you don't end up doing very much of anything with depth, right? And so you're not necessarily covering the thing that is the biggest deal in my neighborhood every single day. You might do one piece next weekend. And so I think the role of specialized media is to provide a record and also to provide that real-time pressure on these issues, right? And so I think there is a different job between the mainstream media and the ethnic media.
Sure. And in many ways, that is definitely still tied to a general trust in media that people can gain, because, you know, when you look to the media and you don't see yourself reflected, I think that poses a lot of barriers for many people. And one of our audience questions was, why do you think that there's so much distrust in mainstream media, and how can we work to regain that?
I think there are a few things here. I think one of the mistakes we make in this conversation very often is to assume that there was once a good old days where everyone trusted us. That didn't exist. There's no point in history to go back to. What's also true is very often when we talk about trust in the mainstream media, we are having a conversation that is implied to be about white people and their trust in the mainstream media, when communities of color have basically never trusted the mainstream media, in part because the coverage provided by the mainstream media has never reflected the realities in communities of color. And so we often don't talk about that when we talk about trust. Rather, we're focused on, why is there a political distrust? Why do so many Republicans say they don't trust us? Why does our uncle at Thanksgiving say he doesn't like us, right? I think it's important to remember those two things. When we talk about distrust among white Americans, when we talk about distrust among white Americans, I think that we can't overlook the fact that we've had one political party that has spent 3 decades campaigning against trusting the media. And I think that is an extremely big and important part of all of this, right? Is that when you have people who've been told over and over and over again not to trust the liberal media, don't trust us, don't trust us, don't trust us, eventually, and that's one of the most well-financed campaigns in our modern history, is the campaign by one party to erode the trust in the media. I think that unquestionably plays a big part of it. And another part of it is the fact that sometimes we get things wrong. Sometimes we're slow to issue corrections. Sometimes we're not particularly humble when people come to us with critique and criticism. Those are not things that engender trust. And so I think that, those are all a really big part of it as well.
Yeah, and I would add that another part is that we don't do a lot to say why we do what we do. We don't talk about the difficult ethical decision making and how we challenge some of our own practices. So given that tonight is the vice presidential debate and the plexiglass setup that they have now, we have a question from Hemet Shah. Specifically, what are your thoughts about how the media cover Kamala Harris when it comes to questions of race? What are we seeing any differences there?
I think there are, it's really interesting. It cuts in a few different directions, right? The thing about having a prominent person of color in these positions is it shows sometimes the collective cultural ignorance of everyone in the media. So for example, Kamala Harris comes from a specific tradition as it relates to her sorority, as it relates to her professional networks. The types of things that for most average Black Americans are obvious. We understand what it means to be an AKA and how that operates and what that might mean about her. But unfortunately, the press corps is not made up of Black Americans for the most part. It's made up for a lot of people for whom these cultural references might be confusing or unclear. I think that the media has also had a real trouble understanding the complexity of Kamala Harris's identity, being the daughter of a Black Jamaican man and a Indian woman. Now, in Black communities, that's not particularly complexing because Black communities have always been diverse this way. Black immigrants, Black people who are intermarried and biracial, and yet for a media, again, primarily made up of white journalists that is very used to discussing things in a Black-white binary, that can be remarkably confusing. What is she really? How does this really work? While, like I said, I think for a lot of us who have a little more experience with these issues, none of this is particularly perplexing. And so I think that kind of stuff comes up time and time again. And what's also true, again, is I think so often the biggest mistake we make in political media is to make sweeping broad generalizations in our beliefs of Black voters, right? That of course they will not like this about Kamala, or of course they will like Kamala. The suggestion that she was going to be a runaway and a shoo-in for the nomination because she was going to have Black support. And again, that made a representational assumption of Black voters that was not true, that they would support her because she was Black. And so again, I think that there's a lot to be said for the complexity and the diversity of Black people, and how they relate to these candidates. And you can't put people in boxes that way.
So one last audience question. What's it like being part of such an iconic news program like 60 Minutes, and taking it in new directions with the 60 and 60 concept?
Look, I think it's amazing. It's a lot of fun. When I first got this opportunity, you don't turn down a chance to work with the team at 60 Minutes. I thought even if I can sneak in the door for one day, I'll learn a few things and they'll kick me out. I realize I'm not supposed to be there. But it's been a few months now, and so I haven't been kicked out yet. Knock on wood. I haven't checked my email since we've been on this, so maybe I have been. But the thing that I love about 60 Minutes are that the values of 60 Minutes are storytelling, are impact, investigation, taking people to places you wouldn't otherwise be, telling people stories they wouldn't otherwise hear about, and also that it's correspondent driven. That from the very beginning, be it Mike Wallace or Ed Bradley or Leslie Stahl, the correspondents are real people. They're not news robots. That doesn't mean that they're not fair, doesn't mean that they don't hold themselves to standards, but there's room in these conversations and these interviews and these reports for them to be real human beings. And I think that's really important. Again, I can trust a human being, even if I disagree with that human being, if I know who they are, right? And I think that is, I think, something 60 Minutes has always understood, and that I think a lot of the media would do better to also understand.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to close with one question that I like to ask reporters, because the best of journalism ethics is all about self-reflection. So what's a decision or a choice that you made that you'd like to get back again, or something where you went astray and you found your way out of it?
I think that for me, and I don't know that I can point to like a specific turning point on it, but I think for me, that one of the biggest lessons to learn early on is a pretty strict no surprises rule. And what I mean by that is that when you do journalism, you're going to write things that make people upset. You're going to write things people aren't happy about, that make their bosses look bad, that make them look bad, that if you're good enough at your job, get people fired or arrested. But I think it's extremely important that you have a strict no surprises rule. And what I mean by that is, I used to say this when I worked at the Post, if I'm going to kick you between the legs on the front page of the Washington Post, you have a right to know the kick's coming. That sometimes as journalists, we hoard away our information. And no one gets to know what I'm writing about till tomorrow when it's in the paper, and you don't want to comment? Okay, bye. And that's just not really how I operate, and haven't operated that way in a long time. The people who I cover get to know what I'm saying tomorrow about them. Because if what I want to know is if I've gotten anything wrong, they need to know what I'm going to say. And even on something sensitive. So look, tomorrow in the newspaper, I'm going to say this about you and this about you and this about you and this about you. Are any of those things wrong? What don't I have right? What do you want? And if you want to go off the record on background to explain to me in your best reason and your best version why I have it wrong, I trust myself to make the decision of whether or not I believe you, or whether or not you have actually presented a legitimate argument, right? I think that, again, the call for comment, even to the villain in our story, cannot be just emotion we go through. And in fact, very often the villain in the story should be the person we spend the most amount of time with. And we do that not just out of fairness, so I think the fairness part of that is very important. We do this also to protect ourselves and to serve our readers. We want to have the most accurate journalism possible that is the most best contextualized, answers the most questions, and doesn't get anything wrong. And sometimes the way to make sure you don't have anything wrong is to make sure you're asking the people if you've gotten anything wrong before you hit the button.
Wow, this has just been an absolutely fantastic conversation, Wesley. I'm so glad it's recorded because I'm going to be sharing it with the world. So just to wrap up a few things. First of all, thank you to everyone involved. To Mia, you did a great job. All your professors are proud of you. And to Krista Eastman and Peter Kleppen operating behind the scenes. We couldn't have done this without you. Again, thanks to UW-Madison for the Journalist in Residence program and bringing people like Wesley to campus for all of us to engage with. Well, to campus virtually this semester. Next year, I'm confident we'll be back in person. I did want to let you know that our next Journalist in Residence program, which is Journalism in Extraordinary Times, is going to be Wednesday, October 28th at 5 o'clock. It's going to be with Kendra Pierre-Lewis, who is from Gimlet Media. She's going to be here in conversation with Professor Dietram Scheufele. They're going to be talking about climate change and climate reporting and how the news media frame controversial issues. So that's definitely going to be one to watch. And then the final one is going to be Thursday, October 29th. So just the next day at 7 o'clock. Again, these are all Central Time, by the way. And that's going to be where we're going to have Maggie Haberman from the New York Times. And she is going to be talking about the complexities of covering policy and politics during this controversial 2020 election and during the time of a pandemic. So again, those are Wednesday, October 28th at 5 and Thursday, October 29th at 7. So I hope that you'll be able to join us here at UW-Madison for those. They should be fantastic talks. So again, Wesley, deepest thanks for being with us. You've given us so much to chew on, and we deeply appreciate it.
Happy to be here. Happy to have the conversation. These were really great and really smart questions from both of you. I really appreciate it. And the 2 talks you just announced are with women who are far smarter than me, and so everyone should make sure to show up for those.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you.